Shrapnel tore through Sergeant First Class Dwayne O'Connor's abdomen hours ago, yet he fought off 3 medics with the ferocity of a cornered predator. He wanted to die on his own terms. Then she walked into the triage tent. He stopped thrashing. He knew that face. He knew her legend. First, Lieutenant Aileen Cruz plunged her hands into the freezing iodine-tinted water of the scrub basin. The rhythmic thumping of an incoming UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter vibrated through the reinforced canvas of the medical tent at Forward Operating Base Kestrel. It was 300 hours in northern Syria, and the night was already unraveling. Aileen did not flinch at the noise. Over the past 4 years, she had conditioned herself to feel nothing when the sirens wailed. She dried her hands, her face an unreadable mask illuminated by the harsh, flickering fluorescent bulbs strung overhead. Outside, the chaotic symphony of a mass casualty event was beginning. Shouting voices, the screech of stretcher wheels over gravel, and the distinct panicked bark of the triage officer. But inside Trauma Bay 1, Aileen stood perfectly still waiting. Aileen bore a nickname she despised, one that had followed her across continents and oceans from the sterilized hallways of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, all the way to this godforsaken desert. They called her the Angel of Death. 3 years prior, a string of catastrophic, highly publicized fatalities occurred in her intensive care ward back in Maryland. 5 critically wounded soldiers, all expected to make miraculous recoveries, had died of sudden, unexplained cardiac arrests during her night shifts. The media had run rampant with the story painting her as a rogue mercy killer, a deranged caretaker, ending the suffering of wounded heroes. A grueling 12-month military tribunal eventually cleared her of all charges, proving that a severe manufacturing defect in a specific batch of intravenous potassium was the true culprit. But exoneration in a courtroom does not erase the whispers in the mess hall. The stigma clung to her. She transferred to frontline trauma surgery to escape the staring eyes of the states, burying herself in the most brutal, unforgiving environment she could find. "Incoming Priority 1, screamed Specialist Miller, throwing back the tent flap. 2 medics rushed in, struggling to maintain their grip on the stretcher. The man strapped to the gurney was massive, his tactical gear shredded and soaked in a dark, terrifying crimson. It was Sergeant First Class Dwayne O'Connor, a seasoned operator with Delta Force Task Force 71. But Dwayne wasn't unconscious, nor was he succumbing quietly to hypovolemic shock. He was violently awake, his eyes wide and wild with a terrifying paranoid clarity. As Miller reached over to administer an initial dose of morphine, Dwayne's hand shot out with terrifying speed. He grabbed the specialist by the wrist, twisting it sharply until Miller dropped the syringe with a yelp of pain. "Get away from me!" Dwayne roared, his voice a gravelly, desperate rasp. He thrashed against the nylon restraints across his chest, the heavy metal buckles groaning under his immense strength. "Don't touch me with that. None of you touch me. Sergeant, you have a ruptured femoral and multiple shrapnel wounds to the lower quadrant." A second medic, Corporal Jenkins, pleaded, trying to press a thick combat dressing against Dwayne's side. "You're bleeding out. We need to push fluids and get you sedated right now." "I said back off!" Dwayne snarled, kicking out his good leg and sending Jenkins stumbling backward into a tray of surgical instruments. The clatter of steel hitting the floor echoed sharply over the helicopter rotors outside. Dwayne was sweating profusely, his skin a sickly, ashen grey. He was operating on pure adrenaline and a terrifying, unyielding stubbornness. He was dying and he knew it, but he was defending himself against the very people trying to save him. Aileen stepped forward from the shadows of the scrub station. She moved with a slow, deliberate calmness, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the medics. She motioned for Miller and Jenkins to step back. They obeyed instantly, relieved to hand the explosive patient over to the trauma nurse. Aileen walked to the side of the gurney and looked down at the Delta operator. Dwayne's chest heaved, his hand still hovering protectively over his holster, which had thankfully been emptied outside. He glared up at her, his jaw set ready to fight her, just as he had the others. But as his eyes locked onto her face, the furious defiance in his expression faltered. The wildness in his pupils sharpened into a profound, chilling recognition. He stopped thrashing. His breathing hitched, slowing from an animalistic pant to a strained, deliberate rhythm.
"I know you," Dwayne whispered, his voice suddenly sounding incredibly weak.
The adrenaline finally beginning to fray. "I saw your picture at the trial." "My name is Lieutenant Cruz," Aileen said, her voice flat, devoid of bedside manner. She pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the latex snapping loudly in the quieted room. "I'm the lead trauma nurse here." A grim, humorless smile touched the corners of Dwayne's pale lips. "Cruz, right. The angel of death." He let out a harsh, wet cough. "They sent the Grim Reaper to Kestrel. Fitting." "I can be whatever you want me to be, Sergeant," Aileen replied, her tone icy and professional. She picked up a heavy pair of trauma shears. "But right now, you are bleeding into your own abdominal cavity at a rate of roughly a pint every 2 minutes. If I don't clamp that artery, you won't live long enough to tell me why you're trying to break my medic's arms. I'm not letting them put that garbage in my veins." Dwayne ground out, gesturing with his chin toward the discarded morphine syringe on the floor.
"I'd rather bleed out." "You want to die?" Aileen asked, leaning in closer, invading his space.
Her eyes bored into his, challenging him.
"I want to live," Dwayne hissed, his hand reaching up, his blood-stained fingers wrapping weakly around the collar of her scrubs.
He pulled her down an inch closer.
"But if they hook me up to those IV bags, I'm a dead man anyway."
"Just like my squad," Aileen froze. The room seemed to drop. She stared into Dwayne O'Connor's eyes, looking for the telltale signs of delirium, traumatic brain injury, or hypoxia-induced psychosis. But underneath the pain, his eyes were devastatingly lucid. He wasn't raving. He was issuing a warning. The silence in Trauma Bay 1 was deafening, broken only by the erratic beep of the heart rate monitor that Specialist Miller had managed to attach to Dwayne's finger. The numbers were plummeting. Blood pressure was dropping to catastrophic levels.
Aileen gently but firmly peeled Dwayne's fingers off her collar.
"Miller, Jenkins," she said without turning around. "Wait outside. Secure the flap."
"No one comes in until I say so." "But Lieutenant, he needs—" "I said get out, Miller." Aileen snapped, her voice cracking like a whip.
The two medics exchanged a worried glance but hurried out of the tent, dropping the heavy canvas flap shut behind them. Aileen was alone with the Delta Force operator, the famed angel of death, and a soldier who refused to be saved.
"Talk!" Aileen commanded, moving swiftly to the side of the gurney.
She bypassed the standard IV setup and reached beneath the table, pulling out a rapid infusion cooler containing fresh whole blood donated locally by the base's walking blood bank, not shipped in from the central supply network. "Why do you think my meds are going to kill you?" Dwayne winced as a fresh wave of agony washed over him.
"My team, we were hit near the border. Standard ambush."
"We took casualties. Nothing we couldn't handle." He gasped for air, his chest trembling. Doc patched up 2 of my guys, gave them standard field morphine and normal saline from the new supply drop. Aileen deftly inserted a large bore needle into the crook of Dwayne's left arm, bypassing the fluid bags he had rejected and connected it directly to the fresh whole blood. He watched her do it, noting the different source, and for the first time he relaxed his arm, allowing the needle in. "And then what happened?" Aileen asked, her hands moving mechanically to pack his abdominal wound with quick clot combat gauze, applying intense downward pressure. Dwayne groaned in agony, his head throwing back against the gurney. 3 minutes later, he gasped out, fighting through the pain. Both of them dead, not from the gunshot wounds. They seized up.
"Heart attacks. Foaming at the mouth."
"Same as the stories about you." Aileen's heart skipped a beat. The memory of the Walter Reed monitors flatlining flashed behind her eyes, the sudden, inexplicable cardiac arrests. Our medic went to check the vials. Dwayne continued, his voice fading, the blood loss taking its toll despite the transfusion. Sniper took him out before he could, but I saw the lot numbers on the crates when we loaded up the trucks this morning. Same lot numbers that arrived at this FOB 2 days ago. Aileen's mind raced. 2 days ago, a massive emergency medical supply shipment had been expedited to Kestrel, authorized and personally overseen by the base's logistics commander, Captain Gage Watson. Watson was a smooth-talking, fiercely ambitious officer who had frequently clashed with Aileen over her strict inventory protocols. Why would someone sabotage the medical supplies? Aileen asked, securing the packing and preparing a combat tourniquet to place high on his thigh to staunch the femoral bleeding until the surgeon arrived.
"Money," Dwayne whispered, his eyelids drooping. "Watson!"
He's been running off the book supply lines, selling high-grade military pharmaceuticals to local warlords. Replacing our stock with cheap black market counterfeits cut with lethal fillers to hide the deficit. Dwayne reached out his bloody hand weakly, grasping Aileen's wrist. I refused treatment because I didn't know who was in on it. But then I saw you. You trusted the angel of death? Aileen asked, a bitter irony lacing her words. You took the fall for bad meds once, Dwayne said, a grim smile returning.
I figured you wouldn't let it happen twice.
You'd know. Aileen stared at the IV bags hanging on the rack next to the bed. Standard normal saline and morphine sulfate. She stepped away from Dwayne for a second, grabbing a sterile syringe. She drew a small amount of clear liquid from the morphine vial and squirted it onto a chemical test strip she kept for checking expired field supplies. The strip, which was supposed to remain pale yellow, instantly turned a violent, corrosive black. It wasn't morphine. It was a potent, cheaply synthesized neurotoxin, likely a byproduct of whatever black market lab had faked the packaging. Administering even a standard dose would cause immediate catastrophic heart failure. It looked like a natural complication of combat trauma. It was the perfect murder weapon to cover up massive theft. Aileen felt a cold, terrifying fury rise in her chest. The nightmare of Walter Reed wasn't just following her. It had mutated, weaponized by a corrupt officer in a war zone. Suddenly, the heavy canvas flap of the tent was ripped open. Standing in the entryway, flanked by 2 armed military police officers, was Captain Gage Watson. His uniform was crisp, completely at odds with the dirt and blood of the FOB. His eyes swept the room, landing on the discarded syringe, the bypassed IV bags, and finally, on Aileen. Lieutenant Cruz, Watson said smoothly, though his eyes were cold and calculating. I was informed we had a hostile, insubordinate patient refusing medical care.
Step away from the sergeant.
He is being transferred to my custody for immediate medevac. We'll handle his treatment from here. Aileen looked at Watson, then down at the terrifyingly black test strip in her hand, and finally at Dwayne, who was slipping into unconsciousness, his life hanging by a thread. She was the only thing standing between a wounded hero and an execution masked as medical care. The angel of death slowly turned to face the captain, slipping the test strip into her pocket. I'm afraid that's impossible, Captain, Aileen said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. The sergeant is in critical condition. He doesn't leave this table until I say so, and I haven't even begun his treatment. Captain Gage Watson narrowed his eyes, the polite veneer peeling away to reveal the cold, calculating predator beneath. He stepped further into the harsh, flickering light of Trauma Bay 1, his polished boots clicking sharply against the blood-stained concrete floor. The 2 military police officers trailed him like heavily armed shadows, their hands resting uneasily on their holstered sidearms. Aileen did not flinch. She positioned her body squarely between the advancing commanding officer and the bleeding Delta Force operator on the gurney. Her hand remained firmly pressed against the quick clot dressing packed into Dwayne O'Connor's abdomen. The soldier's breathing was shallow, his skin a translucent waxy white under the fluorescent bulbs. He was fading fast, but the rapid infusion cooler of fresh whole blood was slowly working its way into his circulatory system, buying them precious minutes. "Lieutenant Cruz, you are walking a very dangerous line," Watson said, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register. "This soldier is part of a classified operation. His extraction and subsequent medical care fall under my direct logistical purview. Step aside." "Your purview ends where my triage bay begins, Captain," Aileen retorted, her voice echoing with steely authority. "Protocol mandates that unstable patients cannot be transferred without clearance from the chief trauma surgeon. Major Reynolds is currently operating on 2 other casualties."
"Until he signs the release, Sergeant O'Connor is my patient." Watson's jaw tightened.
He glanced at the bypassed IV bags hanging innocently on the stainless steel rack, then down at the floor where the discarded morphine syringe lay in a pool of iodine and saline. He was a smart man and he could read the scene perfectly. He knew Aileen had figured it out. "Corporals," Watson commanded, not taking his eyes off Aileen. "Secure the patient for transport. If the lieutenant interferes, place her under arrest for insubordination and mutiny in a combat zone." The 2 young MPs exchanged a hesitant glance. Arresting a trauma nurse in the middle of a mass casualty event went against every instinct they had, but Watson was a high-ranking officer. They stepped forward, their faces tight with conflict. "Stop right there," Aileen commanded, her voice cracking like a whip. She snatched a heavy stainless steel surgical clamp from the Mayo stand beside her, wielding it less like a medical instrument and more like a weapon. "If you disconnect this bloodline, he will die of hypovolemic shock before you reach the helipad. You will be actively committing murder on a United States soldier." The MPs froze. The word murder hung heavily in the sterile air, chilling them to the bone. Watson realized the MPs were losing their resolve. He needed to isolate Aileen. "Wait outside," he barked at the 2 guards, his face flushing with suppressed rage. "Secure the perimeter of the tent."
No one enters.
"I will reason with the lieutenant myself." Relieved to be dismissed from the immediate conflict, the MPs swiftly exited, dropping the heavy canvas flap shut. The chaotic sounds of the forward operating base, the whirring choppers, the distant shouts, the rumbling diesel engines were suddenly muffled, leaving a suffocating silence inside the tent. Watson sighed, adopting an expression of weary disappointment. He slowly unbuttoned his uniform jacket, exposing his sidearm. It was a subtle, deliberate threat. "You are making a terrible mistake, Aileen," Watson said smoothly, using her first name to establish a twisted sense of intimacy. "You're a pariah, the infamous angel of death. The military only kept you around because they needed warm bodies on the front lines. Do you really think anyone is going to believe your word over a decorated logistics commander?" "They didn't believe me at Walter Reed," Aileen replied, her eyes locked on his hand hovering near his holster. "But they will believe the chemical evidence. I tested your morphine, Watson. It's spiked with a synthetic neurotoxin. I know you've been swapping the supply lines, selling the real pharmaceuticals to warlords, and replacing our stock with lethal counterfeits." Watson let out a dark, humorless chuckle. "You're smart, Cruz, smarter than the rest of the sheep on this base. But you lack vision. This war is a meat grinder. We pour billions of dollars into this desert. And for what? To patch up kids so they can go out and get blown up again? I'm simply redirecting resources to where they are actually valued." "You killed Sergeant O'Connor's squad mates," Aileen stated coldly. "You murdered American soldiers to cover a supply deficit." "Casualties of war, Lieutenant," Watson said, shrugging off the accusation as if discussing a minor accounting error. "And speaking of casualties, it truly is a tragedy what is about to happen here." Watson reached into his pocket and pulled out a fresh, sealed syringe. The label read morphine sulfate. He uncapped it with his teeth, spitting the plastic cap onto the floor. "You're going to inject him?" Aileen said, her body tensing, preparing to fight. "You're going to silence him."
"And then what, shoot me?" "Shoot you? Heavens no." Watson smiled, a cold, predatory grin.
"I'm going to inject him. When his heart stops, I'll call the MPs back in. They will find the angel of death standing over another dead hero. I'll testify that you snapped, that the pressure of the mass casualty event triggered your old psychotic habits. You'll be court-martialed, dishonorably discharged, and spend the rest of your life in Leavenworth. The media will eat it up.
It's the perfect narrative. Watson lunged forward, pushing Aileen hard in the chest.
She stumbled backward, crashing into the tray of surgical instruments. Scalpels, clamps, and forceps clattered to the concrete floor in a chaotic din. Watson stepped up to the gurney, raising the syringe toward Dwayne's exposed intravenous line. Suddenly, a massive, blood-soaked hand shot up from the surgical table. Dwayne O'Connor, fighting through unimaginable agony and the fog of severe blood loss, gripped Watson's wrist with a vice-like strength. "Not today," Dwayne rasped, his eyes burning with the fierce, unyielding fire of a Tier 1 operator. Watson grunted in surprise, trying to wrench his arm free, but the Delta Force sergeant's grip was locked like a steel trap. Even half-dead, Dwayne possessed a terrifying raw strength born from years of elite physical conditioning and sheer willpower.
"Let go, you stubborn fool," Watson snarled, raising his free hand to strike the wounded soldier across the face.
Before the blow could land, Aileen launched herself from the floor. She didn't reach for a scalpel or a blunt instrument. Instead, she grabbed the heavy, high-voltage paddles of the manual defibrillator sitting on the crash cart.
"Clear!" Aileen screamed.
She jammed the hard plastic paddles directly into Watson's ribcage and slammed the discharge buttons. A massive jolt of electricity surged through the captain's body. Watson let out a strangled, agonizing shriek as his muscles violently convulsed. He flew backward, crashing through a partition screen and collapsing into a heap of tangled medical supplies. The lethal syringe spun across the floor, skittering into the dark corners of the tent. Dwayne's hand fell back to the table, his chest heaving violently. "Nice bedside manner," he choked out, a faint, bloody grin touching his lips before his eyes rolled back and he finally slipped into unconsciousness. Aileen didn't hesitate. She threw the defibrillator paddles aside and rushed back to Dwayne. His heart rate monitor was screaming a high-pitched continuous alarm indicating severe bradycardia. The exertion had pushed his battered body past its absolute limit. Across the room, Watson groaned, rolling onto his hands and knees. The electric shock had severely disoriented him, but his military training was kicking in. He shook his head, clearing the fog, and his eyes locked onto Aileen.
Pure, unadulterated hatred contorted his face.
He reached down to his hip, unholstering his standard-issue Beretta M9 sidearm. "You crazy witch!" Watson panted, racking the slide and pointing the barrel directly at Aileen's back. "You're both dead." "I wouldn't pull that trigger, Captain." A booming, authoritative voice echoed from the entrance of the tent. Watson froze. He slowly turned his head. Standing in the torn flap of the medical tent was Colonel David Harrison, the base commander of FOB Kestrel. Flanking him were not the two young MPs, but four heavily armed, mud-caked Delta Force operators from Task Force 71, Dwayne's backup squad, who had just returned from the ambush site. Their suppressed rifles were raised, the laser sights painting a constellation of red dots squarely on Watson's chest and forehead.
"Drop the weapon, Gage,"
Colonel Harrison commanded, his voice shaking with absolute fury.
"Drop it now, or my men will cut you in half." Watson's hands began to tremble.
He looked at the laser sights, then at the base commander, and finally at Aileen, who was ignoring the guns entirely, furiously performing CPR on the unconscious Dwayne. The heavy pistol slipped from Watson's fingers, clattering onto the concrete floor. The Delta operators moved with terrifying speed, swarming the captain, driving him to the ground, and securing his wrists with heavy tactical zip ties. Colonel Harrison stepped into the trauma bay, his eyes surveying the chaotic scene. The discarded syringe, the bypassed IV bags, and the frantic trauma nurse fighting for his soldier's life.
"Colonel,"
Aileen shouted, not breaking her rhythm of chest compressions.
I need Major Reynolds in here right now.
He's in cardiac arrest. The femoral artery is blown and I need a surgical team. Reynolds is on his way, Lieutenant, Harrison said, stepping closer, awe bleeding into his stern expression.
How did you know?
Sergeant O'Connor warned me, Aileen grunted, pressing down hard on Dwayne's chest. And I tested the morphine.
It's spiked.
Watson confessed to everything. He was running a black market pharmaceutical ring. Harrison looked down at the disgraced captain, who was being dragged to his feet by the furious Delta operators. Is this true, Watson? Watson spat blood onto the floor, saying nothing. We heard the whole thing, sir. One of the Delta operators growled, tapping the tactical headset over his ear. Lieutenant Cruz had her medical comms channel locked open, broadcasted the entire conversation across the tactical net. Aileen allowed herself a fraction of a smile. When Watson had dismissed the MPs, she had subtly reached up and clicked the broadcast toggle on her chest rig. Every medic, radio operator, and commander with an earpiece on the base had heard the captain's arrogant, damning confession.
Get him out of my sight, Harrison ordered in disgust.
Throw him in the holding cells. He's going to Leavenworth. As the operators dragged Watson out of the tent, the flap opened again, and Major Reynolds, the chief trauma surgeon, rushed in with a team of scrub nurses pushing a sterile surgical cart. I've got him, Cruz. Back away, Reynolds shouted, immediately taking over the resuscitation efforts.
Aileen stepped back, her hands covered in blood, her breath coming in ragged, exhausted gasps.
She watched as the surgical team swarmed Dwayne, their skilled hands moving in a synchronized, desperate dance to save the operator's life. For the first time in 3 years, the heavy, suffocating weight that had crushed Aileen's spirit began to lift. The ghosts of Walter Reed, the lingering doubts, the whispers, the horrific nickname seemed to finally dissolve in the harsh light of the desert medical tent. She had not been the angel of death tonight. 3 weeks later, the blistering sun beat down on the tarmac of Ramstein Air Base in Germany. The heavy cargo ramp of a C-17 Globemaster lowered with a hydraulic whine, revealing the sterile interior of a flying intensive care unit. Aileen stood at the base of the ramp, her uniform crisp, a silver bar pinned to her collar. She had been officially commended by Central Command, cleared of all lingering suspicions, and promoted to captain. The military tribunal for Gage Watson was already underway, with the test strip and the recorded comms broadcast serving as irrefutable evidence of his treason. 2 Air Force medics wheeled a heavily bandaged but very much alive patient down the ramp. Dwayne O'Connor looked pale, having lost a dangerous amount of weight during his recovery, but his eyes were bright and sharp. As the wheelchair reached the tarmac, he held up a hand signaling the medics to stop. He looked at Aileen, a genuine warm smile breaking across his scarred face. I heard they promoted you, Captain Cruz, Dwayne said, his voice raspy but strong.
They did, Aileen replied, stepping closer. And I heard you're being medically retired, Sergeant. Headed back to Montana, Dwayne said.
Figured I've dodged enough bullets for one lifetime. He chuckled, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his surgical staples. He reached out, offering his hand. Aileen took it, feeling the solid living warmth of his grip. Thank you, Aileen, Dwayne said quietly, the humor fading into profound sincerity. You saved my life. You saved mine first, Dwayne. Aileen smiled gently. You trusted me. Well? Dwayne smirked, leaning back in his chair as the medics prepared to move him toward the waiting transport bus. A wise man once told me if you're going to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, it helps to have the angel of death walking right beside you. Aileen watched the transport bus drive away, the exhaust shimmering in the heat haze. She turned and walked back toward the bustling hospital complex, her head held high. The legend of the angel of death was finally dead and buried in the Syrian sand. In its place stood a guardian, Fiercely protective, undeniably brilliant.
and completely unbroken. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat,
Hit that like button and share it with fellow medical drama and military thriller fans. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more intense, true-to-life stories of heroism, betrayal, and redemption. Drop a comment below. Would you have trusted the angel of death? Ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload.